Hi everybody, I make it 12:30. I think it's about time to get underway. Welcome to Agency Limited's Crisis Management in a Pandemic webinar with our experts Helen Gibson and Richard Wood. We took a couple of things to note. We will be sharing the slides with everybody who's registered after the webinar. We'll also be sharing the webinar via social media and hopefully on the website as well. If you can draw your attention to the Q&A facility, if you hover over the Zoom application, the Q&A facility should become apparent. If you're asking any questions through there, that's fine, and we're expecting to be able to respond to some of those towards the end of the webinar. So I'll hand over now to Helen Gibson, and she's going to start with her top 10 tips for managing a crisis. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Damien. That's brilliant. And good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for logging on. Just to briefly introduce myself, I'm Helen Gibson, Managing Director of Agencia, and I've been involved in the business for 10 years and all sorts of different crises that we've faced, not only ourselves, but with clients. And prior to that, I worked at the Cabinet Office. So I've got a certain amount of experience that I'm really keen to share with you this afternoon. But just to hand over to Rick for a brief introduction.
Hello and good afternoon to you, and thank you very much for tuning into the webinar. Just very briefly, just to give you a taster of my background, certainly it's been a career that has gone from one crisis to another, and indeed I think my wife would firmly agree with it. I started off my life as a safety officer on oil tankers carrying aviation fuel, which is extremely flammable, out of the Gulf during the Gulf War. I became a senior investigating officer with the police, managing a specialist team of child protection experts investigating child murders. I then moved into counter-terrorism on the planning side with the Home Office. I have 20 years experience in crisis and war-torn countries for the Foreign Office and the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Latterly, I've been a diplomat with the EU's External Action Service, specifically working across the Balkans. I am listed as a senior conflict advisor with the UK government and currently director for justice, policing and security with Agencia. Back to you, Helen.
Thanks, Rick. And the reason that we decided to put on this webinar was obviously we're all facing some very different and difficult decisions at the moment with the situation that we're facing. But there's one constant, and that constant for all of us is how we can best manage the crisis with the aim of riding the storm and coming through the other side. And there's lots of theories and models and talk about this on the internet at the moment, and various stories sort of running wild, telling us how best to do it. But what we wanted to do today was really to share from our own experience of all the sorts of things that we've handled collectively, the top things that we thought would help you. So just to start off, our first top tip for you is to do all that you possibly can to keep things simple. A crisis, unfortunately, doesn't give us the luxury of time to digest and react to the models and the things that are going on around us. So now is the time to keep things as simple and as straightforward as you possibly can, with both feet firmly on the ground. However, there are some issues that are going to be particularly important to take the time out to consider, and it's really important that you do that. But fundamentally, number one is do everything you possibly can to keep things simple. So moving on to Rick.
Thanks, Helen. And the second one is about communication. Communication is exceptionally important. We need to maintain quick, slick and precise communication, now more important than ever. Communication and communication paths are now of paramount importance. Effective both internal and external communication starts off by helping us to identify really what the problem is. And in this instance, believe it or not, it is not necessarily COVID-19, but it is the effect of COVID-19 on the organization and what you are going to do about it. And the only way that we can look at that links into the next tip that's going to be talked through from Helen. Back to you, Helen.
Okay, thanks, Rick. So our top tip number 3 is to have bite-sized chunks. And you've probably heard of that many times before, but particularly at a time of crisis, it's so important that we break things down as far as we possibly can do into chunks that are manageable for people and possible for us to digest at this time. So as an organisation, you'll need to agree, what does this crisis actually mean for you? What are the potential consequences for the organisation and the individuals as well? And how can we break these down into the smallest possible component parts rather than trying to deal with the whole problem at the same time? And again, you've probably heard the phrase, no one ever ate an elephant in one chunk. And I think it's particularly important that we really bear that in mind at this time. And once you've managed to break things down into those individual parts, you can then begin to look at how you prioritize and action those different parts into where you can delegate to different people in the team, what is the most urgent, what can be ignored, how's the communication going to work, and what are the actual priorities for each of those bite-sized chunks that you're working with. There are going to be many different jigsaw pieces in the mix, but being able to break them down into those small manageable pieces will help you to get through with your team. So that's top tip number 3, do bite-sized chunks wherever you can.
Okay, and then back to me then to go on to top tip number 4. And this is about making sure that there's a fuse in the decision-making process. In a crisis, there's a tendency to try to move extremely quickly, sometimes too quickly, from noting a given situation to reacting to that situation, to judging the situation and then intervening. This is a well-recognized cycle that becomes oiled and very, very slippery. And we move around it much more quickly, and as I've said, sometimes too quickly in a crisis, when risks and emotions are heightened. We've learned that in normal life, it's a good idea sometimes to sleep on it, to take time out to think it through, to phone a friend even, or to discuss it with your team. Now, in this instance, obviously, we're trying to move quickly, we're trying to understand, we're trying to make decisions, and we'll move on to talking about how to make decisions in a moment or two. But these decisions have to be made clearly and with some thought. So try not to make decisions too quickly. Put a fuse into your cycle, take time out, think it through. And the thinking it through comes in the next section, and Helen's going to talk about how to make that decision and how it will all work out. Back to you, Helen.
Okay, thank you, Rick. That's great. And top tip number 5 is not just about making decisions, which of course is going to be critical, but it's about making ethical decisions and making the right decisions, which of course can be very difficult at a time where you're under pressure, things need to be done quickly, but having that solid ethical decision making is so important. And there's a number of steps that we can take to help us try and make the best possible ethical decisions, even though we're in that very difficult decision making situation and under pressure. And there are 5 parts to that. Part number 1, if you're trying to make a decision, you need to gather as much information as you can. What do we know? What do we need to know? How can we develop the information? Who's going to be involved? Why are we at this particular position at this point in time? So do what you can to gather the information that will assist you in making a good decision. And of course, it's not always possible to get the information you'd ideally like to have, but to be aware that any information you can get to help you will be important in informing that decision-making process. The second thing is to assess the threat and the risk. So when you're making these decisions, actually, what are the threats? What are the risks? How can we best try to manage those risks right now? Do the opportunities outweigh the risks? How can you mitigate for some of the threats and the risks that are going to be coming up? And what's your immediate working strategy to try and minimize those risks so that you can move forward as safely as possible? So that's the second thing in your decision-making process. The third thing is to check the authority that you actually have to make that decision. Is it within your remit? Are the policies, frameworks, sort of what are the operating parameters that you've got to make that decision? And again, it can be quite easy in this sort of situation for people to be pushed very much out of their comfort zones and out of their day-to-day roles and put in situations where they're having to make decisions that they wouldn't normally have to make. So just be aware of what authority you actually have to make those decisions. The fourth element in that decision-making process is to assess the options and contingencies that you might have available to you. So have you got more than one option, or actually is there only one option? What kind of contingencies can be linked to these options? And what's your preferred option? And what are the reasons behind that particular option being the preferred option? Is it the right reason, or are you just thinking that's the easy thing to do, or that's the quick way of doing it when you're making that decision? And finally, the fifth element in that decision-making process is to review your decision-making. What are the actions that you've taken, both you personally, as a team, as an organisation? What is the decision that we're making? What are the actions that are going to follow on from that? And how we're going to review the outcomes and measure actually what's the result of that decision making that we've taken. So a number of steps there that you can take, and following that process will help you to make robust decisions, but also decisions that are ethical and ones that you can be comfortable with making. So that's top tip number 5, maintaining ethical decision making. So over to you, Rick.
Thanks, Helen. And linking to that, when making a decision, it's important to identify priorities and actions, recognizing what you can and can't do. So developing and setting priorities. The decision-making process helps to develop a series of potential actions, and we can take these and develop the priorities. Every potential action has a series of positive and indeed negative forces pushing on it. The positive forces are those that will help you to achieve the action. The negative ones clearly are those that will resist your attempts towards achieving the action. These forces will all have different pressures. Some of the pressures will be low, some will be medium, and some will be high. So if a potential action has low positive forces, but has many high negative forces, you may decide, and quite rightly so, to park it. At least you now have a rational decision for not pursuing something, and you can move on to something that can be influenced and that can be achieved. Once you've identified the different forces, you can concentrate on developing the positive forces and reducing the negative forces. And once broken down into parts, these can be prioritized and they can be actioned, as Helen said earlier, to the most appropriate people in your team. Team members need now more than ever clear communication, and they need to be given responsibility to develop the prioritized actions. And again, these actions need to be in those small bite-sized chunks. So that should help you again in identifying and working through the priorities and developing them into actions that can be achieved. Okay, now back to you, Helen.
Thanks, Rick. That's great. Top tip number 7 and number 8, I'm actually going to run together because they're intertwined. Top tip number 7 is to recognise that it's an emotional time for everybody. So each team member is going to be feeling this in a different way, as are you yourself. So top tip number 7 is simply to recognise that it is a really emotional time for all of us. Closely linked to that is top tip number 8, and that is therefore, if we're recognizing the emotion that's involved right now, it's really important that we focus on our teams and also our own self-care. So top tip number 8 is focus on your team and your own self-care. And in remembering that it's a really emotional time, we need to be really conscious of looking after each other, looking out for each other. Most of us will have been pushed out of our comfort zones, and that's going to affect us all in some quite different ways. Some are going to be feeling very disorientated. Some are going to be pretty angry. Others are going to be very upset. Some might be denying what's actually going on. Others are going to be confused. And other people will accept what's happening and actually really rise to the challenge and take a positive problem-solving approach. But I think it's really important to recognise that there's going to be a whole spectrum of emotions, reactions, ways of responding to the situation that we're in. And there's going to be some great team and individual effort along the way, some really heroic efforts that people are making, pulling out all the stops, but there are also going to be some real storms and some bumps on what's undoubtedly a bumpy journey. And these, of course, need to be managed as best as possible. So that's top tip number 7 and number 8. Recognise it's an emotional time and do what you can to focus on your team and your own self-care. Over to you, Rick. Okay,
on that bumpy ride, we're going to link to the emotions and recognizing your team. There's a gentleman called Maslow, who many of us have read and know well his writings, but in essence he reminds us about the health and safety and well-being and keeping people happy. Again, leaders and managers need more than ever to be helping their teams, helping their individuals by acknowledging the disorientation that Helen has mentioned, by supporting them, by giving them responsibility, both to teams and individuals within the team, to solve these bite-sized chunks that we've been talking about, helping them to manage the situation, helping them to understand what's going on both in the organization and around the organization, and of course across the country, and if you're working globally, throughout the world. To develop an awareness, which we're seeing every day, every minute of the day if we're watching television, on our own health and our own safety. But this needs to be reminded to all staff members to help them to feel that they're comfortable within their own environments. We need to ensure that everybody is encouraged, that their contributions are recognized. And this is again why it's so important that they're given responsibility for tasks so that they remain motivated and they remain creative. Creativity at the moment is essential because we're working in an environment that is entirely different to the one that we're used to. We're outside our normal comfort zones. We need to encourage everybody to pace themselves. I've already seen in recent weeks a number of people absolutely going crazy with the fact that they believe that they need to be awake 24 hours a day in order to get through this particular crisis. The reality is that if they do that, they'll soon collapse, and work around them will soon collapse. I would encourage you to pace yourselves, pace your teams, and encourage them to maintain a good home lifestyle work balance. With that thought, Helen, back to you.
Thanks, Rick. That's great. So final top tip number 10, and that is just a reminder of the importance of discipline, resilience, and organisation. And those three things are going to be key to managing the crisis and coming through this as successfully as possible. We know that this crisis will pass, and we need to be as ready as we possibly can be for a return to normal working conditions when that takes place. And therefore, if we've got the discipline in place, the resilience and the right sort of organisation, we help ourselves to be in as good a place as possible and able to recover as quickly as is going to be practical when the time comes. So top tip number 10 is the importance of discipline, resilience and organisation to make sure that you can recover when this passes. Okay, so that's a final top 10 tip. So Rick, you were going to just do a bit of a summary, weren't you?
Yep, and thanks to Damien for putting the slide up. Again, just in 20 minutes, we have gone through 10 top tips. And of course, with all of these issues, if you want to come back to us to ask us more about them, we are more than willing to talk to you about how they can be developed for your organization. Number one, we need to keep things simple. Number two, communicate, communicate, communicate. Quick, slick, and precise. Number three, breaking things down into bite-sized chunks. Number four, making sure that we've put a fuse into the decision-making process. The temptation to be quick in making decisions needs just a little fuse in it. Take your time, make sure you've got it right. And maintain, number five, maintain an ethical decision-making thinking, work it through. Number six, identify your priorities and actions, recognizing what you can and understanding what you can't do. And if you can't do it, park it. Number seven, recognizing with yourself, with your teams, with the individuals that you're working with, that it is an emotional time. Number eight, focus on your people, focus on your own self-care, focus on your team's care as well. As Maslow has suggested, health and safety are important. Keep your teams happy. Number 10, the importance of discipline, resilience, and organization are now paramount. So that is the top 10 tips, all summarized in 20 minutes. And again, to reiterate, if you want to come back to us, we're more than happy to hear from you. And there will be a short question and answer session after Helen has finished summing up. Back to you, Helen.
Thanks, Rick. That's great. So just to say, we've got a final point to make, which is that we're aware, certainly in the Humberside area, which is where we're based, there is an opportunity for funding through the local enterprise partnership. So that is available to get in additional consultancy, advice, support around crisis management. So for anyone that's interested in that, the details are on the slide here, and I'm sure there are similar schemes in other geographical areas as well. So if you want help, there may be some funding that you can access to support you with getting that help. Okay, so that's a final thing. And I think therefore all that remains is our contact details. You can see our faces, nice pictures, and the contact details for both Rick and I. As Rick said, we're very happy to speak to anyone outside of this meeting if you'd like to. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Rick. Lots of really useful information there in a very short space of time. So hopefully everybody managed to digest that. as mentioned, the slides will be shared. And as also mentioned, we'll be sharing the webinar over social media and hopefully on the website as well. To those attendees still with us, which is everybody, which is great. If you do have any questions, the Q&A facility remains available. If you hover over the Zoom application, click on Q&A and you can ask any questions you have there. At this time, Helen, Rick, we don't have any questions. Tell a lie, I spoke too soon. A quick question from Dave. Thanks for joining us, Dave. How do you know who is under severe stress? How can you recognise that?
Okay, well, perhaps I'll start with that, but Rick, please do join in if you wish. I think you will know your teams hopefully fairly well, not always, but you are the ones that are working with people, and hopefully you will be in a position where you spot that people are behaving differently. That might be becoming more withdrawn, or it might be that they're displaying signs of agitation or irritability, or are clearly very emotional. So I think in terms of spotting it, it's to remain close to your team so that you can pick up on that, giving people the space to share how they feel. And of course, that is all going to be done at a distance right now, or likely to be done at a distance. So some of those usual mechanisms are no longer available to us. So it's really important to remain vigilant and aware that people may be changing in their behaviour.
Thanks, Helen. Hopefully that helps, Dave. Sorry, Rick, if you've got anything to add, fire away.
Just to add in on the back of it, I mean, this is a moment in everybody's lives where we all will feel some form of disorientation. Some of us will handle it entirely differently. Some of us will be very pragmatic and face it. Others, as Helen said earlier, some will get angry, some will cry. In essence, what we're trying to cope with something that we don't really understand, and wherever information can be gathered. For example, we've got the World Health Organization, we've got the National Health Service that are providing us with the information about what's going on in terms of COVID-19. And it's useful, I think, if you can collate that and provide that sort of information to ensure that the team has the best information that is available. But also the question, how do you recognize the stress? It's a little bit difficult when you're working remotely, which is why I think it's probably more important that you do take time out to communicate with your teams, not on an overly regular basis, but certainly a little bit more often than perhaps normally. You want to be in touch with them. For example, Helen very nicely organized a tea party over the net last week for the members of the team. So we all sat in front of the cameras and had half an hour together. And during that period, we didn't really talk too much about work. But of course, we also still have our management team meetings, and indeed then the different teams that we work with will meet on an occasional basis via Zoom or Skype or any other electronic means. Most of us now are using WhatsApp or Viber. Now that allows you to keep in touch with everybody in the team, but it also gives you an opportunity to see how people are coping with what's going on. And I think that...
I'm conscious of time.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
We're probably up on time, unless there's any, might be time for one last question, Damien, if there is anything else.
Yeah, well, what we usually do is we hang around sort of for 5 minutes after the expected conclusion of the webinar. If anybody does have any more questions, do feel free. Otherwise, we'll sort of log off in a couple of minutes, if that's okay for yourself, Rick and Helen.
Yeah, that's great. Happy to stay around for as long as people want us to.
Great. Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Rick. And as mentioned, yeah, I am repeating myself, and you've probably heard it already. The webinar will be shared via social media, so do feel free to search for and follow Agencia Limited, and also have a little peek at our website as well, if you can. Rick and Helen are welcoming questions. So if you do have any more queries at the conclusion of the webinar, that's fine. Do feel free to get in touch. Their contact details will be shared, as will the slides. So yeah, if you've got any more questions, do feel free to ask away. And if not, thanks very much for joining us.